Vulnerability has become a hot topic in the workplace. As managers, we need to strike the balance between being vulnerable and being confident. And to help us learn how to embrace the right kinds of vulnerability in the workplace, I spoke with Jacob Morgan, best-selling author of 5 books, including his most recent, Leading with Vulnerability, which is based on over 100 CEO interviews and a survey of 14,000 employees. He's also a professionally trained futurist and a speaker. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jacob. I'm super excited to talk about everyone's favorite topic, vulnerability, and how we can show up and lead with vulnerability and help ourselves and our teams and our team members be more successful in the workplace. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm glad you mentioned everyone's favorite topic, because from a lot of the research that we did, it's not everyone's favorite topic. People are very uncomfortable with it.
Well, I feel like everything that comes up around giving feedback, holding people accountable, like all of that stuff, like it's like nobody ever wants to talk about it. And at the core of it, a big part of that is feeling vulnerable and when you're having those conversations. And so I feel like while it's no one's favorite topic to talk about, it should be our favorite topic because we really, really, really need it. At least that's what the research shows. So maybe you can start by explaining to us what I think is actually a really important nuance that you start out in your book, which is it's not just about being vulnerable, but it's the vulnerability plus leadership. So can you share that equation and why that's so important?
Sure. And so a lot of people are probably familiar with the concept of vulnerability. Obviously, Brené Brown pioneered a lot of this research. It's probably been 15 years now. And, vulnerability in the context of work is essentially doing or saying something that exposes you to the potential of emotional harm. So you say or do something where somebody else could take that information and potentially use it to harm you, makes you feel vulnerable. Now, it's very clear why vulnerability is useful in your personal life, because in your personal life, vulnerability is what allows you to create connections and relationships with your friends, your family members, your spouse, your significant other. But at work, we have a very different dynamic. At work, you have leaders, you have employees, you have customers, projects, deadlines, you're part of a team, you're being paid a salary. So in that very different dynamic, it really makes sense to take a step back and say, is vulnerability in our personal lives the same as it is inside of an organization? And the answer to that is no. And the second aspect of that is vulnerability for leaders the same as it is for non-leaders? And again, the answer there is no. So one of the things that I always tell people is simply being vulnerable at work is probably one of the worst things that you can do, and it will actually hurt you far more than it can help you. And again, the reason for that is because all you're doing is you're exposing these gaps that you have. Leading with vulnerability is about exposing gaps that you have and demonstrating what you're trying to do to close them. So the equation that you mentioned, it's called the vulnerable leader equation. And that is vulnerability plus leadership equals leading with vulnerability. And we've been very obsessed with the vulnerability piece, which it's not to say that on its own it's bad. But imagine for a minute that you show up to work every day and you're constantly talking about, I'm having a tough time. I need help. I don't know how to do this. I made a mistake. You're being vulnerable, but in the context of your leader is not going to look at you and say, oh, thank you for telling me that you made a mistake. Your leader is still going to want to know, well, okay, you made a mistake, but the customer is still not happy. The project is still not done. We still haven't met our deadlines. In other words, what are you going to do about it? So a very simple example is when you make a mistake. It's very vulnerable to go to your leader and say, I know how important this project was, and I'm really sorry I made a mistake. That's vulnerability. Leading with vulnerability will be, I know how important this project was. I'm really sorry I made a mistake, but here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. And here are 3 things that I'm going to do going forward to make sure that mistake never happens again. In other words, I'm demonstrating the learning, the growth. I'm demonstrating that I'm trying to close my gap. And the reason why this is so important is because there's a concept in psychology called the pratfall effect. And the pratfall effect basically is this idea where if you are competent or are demonstrating competence, and then you're vulnerable, you are perceived as now being more likable. You get a little boost. People view you as being more capable, more talented, because really what you're saying is, I'm good at my job, now I'm also human. But the flip side of that is also true. If you are not good at your job and you're not making an effort to be good at your job and you're not demonstrating that you're trying to close those gaps and you're vulnerable, people will view that vulnerability as a way to reinforce your mediocrity. In other words, somebody will look at you and they're going to say, yeah, I get why you're not getting promoted. I get why you've been stuck in that role for years, because you're not demonstrating that you're trying to close those gaps. So it's a very, very important and key distinction for anybody who's looking to get into a leadership role or to be successful in any way, shape, or form. Don't just talk about the gaps that you have. Try to demonstrate what you're trying to do to close those gaps.
Oh my gosh. I feel like this is like the two parts of that. Like it seems so obvious, but it's so important. And I think the example you gave around, going to your boss and saying, I made a mistake. I need help with this, right? Does not look good on you as an employee if you're not closing those gaps, but also you as a leader, right? If you're saying those things to your team members, I made a mistake. I'm not sure about this. And that's all you're saying, they're going to lose faith in you as a leader. And how important it is to demonstrate that you are also taking action on that you are trying to close your gaps. Like it's a two-way street. We need to support our team members to be vulnerable with us. And then we also need to be vulnerable with them. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how do we do that? How do we start to create an environment where our team members feel comfortable leading with vulnerability and coming to us in those ways, but also we can go to them and speak authentically and share what's going on for us?
Yeah, and a part of this is we confuse psychological safety with this. Psychological safety is feeling safe to go to your leader to talk about a mistake or to be vulnerable. That's one thing. That's separate, right? You want to feel safe to be able to do that. But how you actually do that in the best way is what we're talking about, right? So in other words, there's a right way and a wrong way to approach vulnerability in the workplace. Having the safety to do that is one aspect of it. How you do it is what we're talking about, is another entire thing altogether. So the idea then is, well, how do you do it in the right way? So if you're an employee, let's say you're not in a leadership role, the simplest thing that I always tell people is whenever you know that there's going to be some kind of vulnerability present, try to add some leadership to it, right? Try to sprinkle in a little bit of competence in there in any of those types of situations, whether you're asking for help, whether you're talking about something that you might be struggling with, whether you are talking about a failed project, whatever it is, ask yourself, okay, well, I'm going to go to my leader right now or my team, and I'm going to admit to this. I'm going to ask for this. How do I add a little bit of leadership to it? So for example, let's say you need help with something, right? Or I'll give you a very classic example that we see all the time. Let's say you're a new manager, you're a new leader, you just got promoted. And one of the things that we always tell new leaders to do is to, do a little bit of an all hands, talk to your team. You just got promoted, say hi to everybody, motivate them a little bit, let them know you're going to be leading them. And one of the things that new leaders always do is they'll go in front of their team and they'll say, hey, I'm Jacob. I'm a first-time leader here. I've never done this before, but I'm so excited to be leading this team. And I know we're going to do some awesome work together. Thank you so much for having me. And, go team. Now, on the surface, it doesn't sound like a terrible message that you've given. You were a little bit vulnerable in there, but you didn't do anything about leadership. You didn't do anything to demonstrate your competence or the fact that you're trying to close the gap. And so you might leave, or your employees might leave that meeting thinking, well, that was okay, but I kind of feel like I could do Jacob's job. I feel like I could be the leader. Why am I not in that position? So take that same situation and now let's ask ourselves, how do we sprinkle a little bit of leadership into that? So my message might be, hey, I'm Jacob. I'm a first-time leader. I know I've never done this before, but here's some things that I'm going to do to make sure that I'm the best leader that you've ever had. I am asking our chief marketing officer to be coaching and mentoring me. So she's going to be checking in with me once a week. We're going to spend 30 minutes together and she's going to be reviewing my leadership style, my approach, and just making sure that I'm really doing a good job. Here are 3 leadership books that I'm reading, and I encourage you to follow along as well, where I'm going to try to improve my leadership skills. Here's a leadership coach that I have, if you have the ability and resources to do that. Or here's a course that I'm taking. Like, here are things that I'm going to do to make sure that I'm a good leader for you, because I'm acknowledging my gap. I've never done this before. I know I'm new to this, but here's what I'm going to do to be the best leader that you've ever had. And that's a very different message. And now people are going to walk away from that thinking, wow, Jacob is really invested in trying to be a good leader for us. I can tell that he's serious about this. I can tell that he's trying, he's putting in the effort, he's learning, and he's growing. So that's a very different message. So the first thing, again, simple, try to add the leadership piece wherever you can when the vulnerability component is present. And this is true whether you're an individual contributor or whether you're a leader. But for leaders, you can't simply go to your employees and say, hey, I want you to be vulnerable, or I want you to lead with vulnerability. It's not going to work, right? So the way that you do it, as with anything, is you lead by example. And the really interesting thing is, and I shared this chart on LinkedIn fairly recently, we surveyed 14,000 employees in partnership with DDI, which is a big leadership firm. And we found that the more senior you become inside of an organization, the less likely you are to show a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable, and the less likely you are to genuinely inquire about the well-being of those around you. And we see a very precipitous drop when you move from mid-level leadership to senior level leadership. And that could be for a number of reasons, right? Because senior level leaders tend to be a little bit more insulated. They're talking to fewer people. They're in their own bubble. But it's also because the more senior you get inside of an organization, the more you believe that people need to trust you, whereas you don't necessarily need to trust those on your team. Because after all, you're in that senior leadership role. Of course, everybody should trust you. But why do you need to trust an entry-level employee? They haven't earned that trust. Why do you need to trust a mid-level leader? They're not at your level. You don't need to trust them, but they have to trust you. So there's this idea of implicit and explicit vulnerability. In other words, if you're a leader of a team, anybody who works for you is already vulnerable to you. And that's because you can make their life terrible at work if you wanted. You could probably make them work on projects they don't want to do. You could probably mess with their pay, their bonuses. You could do all sorts of things if you don't like somebody on your team, if you're a leader. So we all know that employees are vulnerable to leaders, which means that they're dependent on them, they're vulnerable to them. That's a very explicit relationship. Everybody knows that. But the reality is that leaders are also very vulnerable to their people. Because if the employees don't do a good job, that reflects poorly on the team, which then reflects poorly on the leader. But the difference is in that second scenario, leaders never talk about this. Leaders rarely go to their team and say, I couldn't have done this without you. You are so crucial and such an important part of the team. Without you, things would collapse, or without you, we wouldn't be where we're at. So the best thing for leaders to do is to demonstrate that level of vulnerability with their team. Leaders are usually good at the competence piece, the leadership piece, right? They talk about their rationale for doing things. They are very proud to boast of their accomplishments. So they're very good at the competence piece, but they oftentimes struggle with the connection piece, which is the vulnerability piece. And you need both, because if you only demonstrate competence, people will look at you and they think that they work for a robot. But if you only demonstrate vulnerability, people will look at you and they'll say, well, we have a great relationship and great connection, but that person's incompetent. So you got to have both of these things. And I think the best thing that you can do is lead by example.
It's an interesting example you chose around going to your team and saying, I'm really proud of the work we've done. And the work, I can see how hard you're working and you are so important to this. It's not so obvious that that's actually being vulnerable. Can you share a little bit about some of the different scenarios or situations that people actually experience vulnerability? Because I was definitely surprised when I was learning them in your book.
There are a lot. I think in the book I have 10. I won't go through all 10, and there's probably more. But, when I was interviewing these 100 CEOs, I was asking them, what makes you feel most vulnerable at work? And more interestingly, not just what makes you feel most vulnerable, but how does that actually make you feel physiologically? And it's interesting because physiologically, some of the CEOs I interviewed shared that they had panic attacks. Their palms get sweaty, their heart starts beating, they feel queasy. One CEO said that his voice starts to quiver because he feels so uncertain and so nervous. So you very much get a physiological stress response from vulnerability. So what are some of the vulnerability signs? And I think it's really important to distinguish between a sign versus somebody actually feeling vulnerable, because they're not always the same. And the analogy I give is, if you're driving through a canyon, let's say, and you see a sign on the side of the road where it says, rocks might be falling on the cars. It's a sign telling you to be aware, but it's not necessarily saying that rocks are literally falling on top of your car right now. So same thing with these signs. There are things to be aware of that should tingle your spidey senses, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is feeling vulnerable. They might be, and that should be a sign where maybe you can change your approach, ask questions, check in with the person, or stay away if you need to, depending on the person's personality, but something that you should be aware of. So some of them are very common, right? Asking for help, sign of vulnerability. But it depends on how you ask for help, right? I mean, it's one thing to say hey, I need help with this Wi-Fi password. Can you set this up for me really quick? Probably that person's not feeling that vulnerable. but somebody comes to you and says, hey, you know what? I'm in trouble. I just realized that I committed to both of these things and I'm not able to do it. I'm under so much pressure and people are breathing down my neck. I don't know what I'm going to do. Can you please help me out and do XYZ for me? That person's clearly feeling vulnerable, or it's a big sign of vulnerability. Another one, admitting to a mistake. Very common sign, right? I'm really sorry. I made a mistake. That's very much a sign of vulnerability. But then there are other signs, right? Showing sincere emotion is a sign of vulnerability. And it doesn't always necessarily need to be a negative emotion. We oftentimes forget that showing a positive emotion can be a sign of vulnerability, right? You compliment somebody, and oftentimes being able to accept that compliment and to genuinely say thank you is a sign of vulnerability. I struggle with this. My dad certainly struggles with this, where somebody says something nice to you, and instead of genuinely showing appreciation and how that makes you feel, you're like, oh, thank you. When really you're thinking like, oh my God, that's like the nicest thing. Thank you so much. Like that really made my day. We don't say that because that's a sign of being vulnerable. Giving or receiving praise, talking about uncertainty, those are all signs of vulnerability. So in the book, I talk about 10 of them, and it's important to be able to spot them so that you're aware of them. Because again, when somebody shows a sign of being vulnerable, you can change your approach, maybe be less harsh, maybe check in with them. Hey, how's it going? I know you're in a tough spot. How does that make you feel? And, your approach changes there.
Oh my gosh, the accepting compliments. I feel like this is so many people, and especially women that I know, that as soon as you get a compliment, the answer in your mouth is like, "Oh, it really wasn't such a big deal. Oh, that was nothing." Right? Like it is so hard. I'll speak for myself. It is so hard to accept a compliment. I never
Yeah.
thought of that as a form of like needing to stretch myself and be more vulnerable, but
Yeah.
it really is true. And also, maybe this is just because I was reading your book earlier, but I was in a meeting that we're working on a project related to my mom who passed away a little over a year ago,
Oh,
and
I'm sorry
it
to hear
was
that.
a it was well, thank you. The project itself is really bringing a vision of hers to life, and we like are at this pinnacle moment for this project. And I just started crying in the meeting, and I was like so happy. And I just shared with everyone in the group. I was just like, this is so meaningful to me that this vision of hers has been brought together and is moving forward. And like I just am like so overwhelmed and so proud of this work. And I feel like I want to say thank you to you, because I don't know that if I hadn't just read your book that I would have felt comfortable saying that in that meeting. But it felt so good to say that out loud and to not feel like I needed to like hold back my tears. And I think it's very hard to show emotion, especially I
It
think as
is.
a woman. So really,
Yeah.
like, just thank you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's funny. Even one of the CEOs I interviewed, his name is Jay Bray. He's the CEO of a company called Mr. Cooper Group. It's a home loan company. They have around 9,000 employees. And he told me that the childhood where he grew up, success was never celebrated. There was never like an achievements or a good job. It was always like, well, you got second place. Why didn't you get number one? Or if you got number one, why are you celebrating? You should be preparing for the next thing. And so he has a very hard time celebrating, acknowledging, focusing on the positive and the rewards. And he acknowledged that in the book. It's one of the stories that I share in there where so for him, when there's a win and when he tries to celebrate and acknowledge something positive, he really feels vulnerable because it's not what he's used to. It's not how he grew up. It's not in his DNA. His DNA is always like, great, we won, next. Like, no time to just acknowledge the positive aspect of that. And a lot of people are like that. I can be like that. Sometimes my dad is like that. It's to another level. My dad is like that. I mean, he's a immigrant from the Republic of Georgia. And so I actually grew up thinking vulnerability was stupid. All right. I grew up thinking it's dumb. It's not for me because that's how I was raised.
Wow. Okay. Well, so given that some people like yourself grow up thinking vulnerability is a stupid thing or like a not important thing, and others seem to just have it innately, what are the different ways that we learn to be vulnerable? I mean, you shared some of the tactics of like what we can start to do, but are there other ways that we can kind of learn to be more vulnerable so that those of us who are scared of it or otherwise not so excited about it can make steps in the right direction?
Yeah, there are three things that I talk about in the book as far as how people become vulnerable leaders, because you're right. Some people think it's dumb and doesn't make any sense, and some people somehow have embraced it. So I've found from doing these interviews that there are usually three paths that people take. One is you go through some sort of an experience. The story that I talk about in the book is from Jeffrey Katz, and he used to be the former CEO of Swissair. And he told me that he never believed in vulnerability. He was always very commanding control. That was his personality, right? And he said that one day he was sleeping and he gets a call, I think at like 2 a.m. And he gets a call basically saying that one of the planes disappeared from radar. And he, in his gut kind of knew what that meant. So he quickly rushed to the office. And shortly thereafter, he found out that the plane went down. And I think it was almost, or 229 people passed away. And in that moment, when the families of those people on the plane that crashed, they were engaging with the employees. They all showed up there. He saw how everybody was crying and supporting each other and being open with each other and trying to take care of each other. And he said that was a very pivotal moment in his leadership career. And after that, he completely changed the way that he leads. And he now became a vulnerable leader. He now talked about emotion and feeling and connection and understood why that was so important. So the first thing is you go through some sort of an experience. Now, hopefully the experience isn't going to be something as tragic as what happened with Jeffrey Katz, but it could be any experience that you go through, which kind of, flicks a switch in your head where you are now like, okay, that's clearly not the right way to lead. I'm going to do things differently. And I have a few stories like that in the book. Another one is you're taught this. And so maybe you worked with an executive coach. Maybe you got some feedback from members of your team. But somehow you go through a process where you are taught to lead with vulnerability, right? You're taught that the old school ways of leadership and management no longer make sense. And you are, shown this new way that you should be leading. And a third thing is how you were raised, right? And there are several stories that I have in the book of how these CEOs were raised. One of them is Sal Abate. He's the CEO of a company called Veritiv with 6,000 employees. And he shared this story where early on, he grew up in a big family, big Italian family. And every day at dinner, everybody would get around the dining table and they would talk about how they're feeling, their grievances, their positive. They would be very open and upfront with each other. And he said it was always like this theatrical show where even friends would want to come and participate in the dinner because they were so engaging and enlightening. And, people were really talking about how they were feeling. So he grew up. He was raised in a way to be vulnerable, to be okay with showing emotion, being okay connecting with people and leading them in that kind of a way. So I think those are the three paths that people take. Either you experience something, you are taught to lead this way, or you were raised this way. If none of those three things happen, then it's usually because you're consciously trying to avoid leading with vulnerability. Maybe you've gone through one of those things and you're saying, nope, not going to do it. Doesn't make sense. And you're just consciously pushing it away, which eventually it's going to come back and you're going to be forced to change.
Yeah. Can you share, why would people consciously push it away? Like, if we know all the business cases for it, especially now, what is so scary about it?
I think there are a few things. Number one, there's a lot of unknown, right? So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that I can promise at some point in your life, vulnerability will be used against you. So it's very scary, especially if you're a leader, to say or do something that exposes you to the potential of emotional harm, where somebody might take that information and try to use it as a way to get you fired, to get you demoted, to hurt you in some way. We perceive vulnerability as something that undermines competence. So you don't want to be perceived as being somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, who's not competent, who's not good at their job. So for a leader to genuinely say, hey, I'm not sure what the next course of action is. I'm trying to figure it out just like you. A lot of people are not comfortable with that because the perception that you create of yourself as a leader changes. A lot of us were also not taught that way. Think about all the leadership stereotypes that exist, like the Jack Welch, the Steve Ballmer style. I've interviewed lots of CEOs who literally told me when they were growing up meaning going through the ranks of the corporations that they were a part of, they were literally coached by their leaders at the time to not show emotion, to not apologize, to not admit to mistakes. They were actually taught this by their leaders. When people went through their MBA programs, they were taught this. They were taught to be the celebrity CEO like Jack Welch. When I interviewed Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of GE, he said one of the biggest mistakes that he made during his leadership career is that he didn't say, I don't know often enough, because he was not taught that. It was not encouraged. It wasn't part of the environment that he was at. So I think those are some of the big reasons for why we don't do this. But thankfully, we're having this conversation more and more. And I think people are getting more comfortable with it and realizing that it's actually a huge benefit for you. Because again, and we're not just talking about vulnerability, we're talking about both these pieces, competence and connection. Because when you do both, the first one acknowledges that there's room for improvement, right? Vulnerability is essentially saying there's room for improvement. I can do better. I can be more emotionally intelligent. I can be more competent. I can be more insightful, more wise. Whatever it is, I have this gap. That's what vulnerability is. Leadership is now then saying, here's how I'm going to get better. And so if you think about it from a leadership perspective, the world around you is changing all the time. And so if you want to learn and grow and get better at whatever it is that you do, you cannot do that without leading with vulnerability. So now we're seeing this acknowledgement that to get better, you have to be able to do these things. And so it's being viewed less as like a soft thing and more of like, this is a hard leadership quality of learning and growth. And now that it's being bundled into that, people are getting more comfortable with it.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect place for us to wrap up because it's an essential skill for leadership in today's world. So can you tell us, Jacob, about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss?
See, this is tough because one of the reasons why I left corporate America is because I never worked for a great boss. I never worked for a leader that I felt had my back, that motivated or engaged or inspired me in any way, shape, or form. And that is why I left corporate America 16 years ago now. So I don't know if I've ever had a great boss that I've worked for. I mean, maybe I would go back to when I was 16 years old and I volunteered at a community center, or maybe when I worked at Whole Foods and I had but those were just friends. They weren't good bosses. In other words, I didn't learn and grow from them. They were just kind of like fun people to hang out with because we were, 17, 18 years old. So I don't know, especially from the corporate world, I don't think I've ever worked for a boss where I was like, wow, I'm getting a lot out of this relationship. It's sad, but true.
Well, I feel like this is why you and I both do the work that we do, is because we don't want anyone else to ever have that story and have that answer when they're in the workforce. So, well, thank you for sharing that. And where can people learn more about you? Tell us about your book and where people can find it.
There are a few places. So obviously you can find it wherever books are sold. We made a URL for it, which is leadwithvulnerability.com. So that's one place. I recently put out a PDF on the top 8 leadership trends for 2024. So if anybody's interested in that, they can go to, I believe it's top 8, the number 8 leadership trends, or topleadershiptrends.com. And they should be able to get that PDF that we put together. And then my email, if people have questions about this stuff, is jacob@thefutureorganization.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again for chatting with me today and helping make sense of this thing called vulnerability that we're all supposed to do.
Thank you very much for having me.